go live. So please, yeah, we are. Ma'am, will you please turn on your video because it's already time and we need to start it.
Ma'am, are you saying something?
Yes, Indrani ma'am. I am saying that can you just turn on your video and we can,
Sure.
I mean, we may start because it's already time.
Sure.
Yeah. So people are joining us. They will continue to join us.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. And also on YouTube, we are streaming live. So there is also people who are listening to you.
Right.
So thank you for all for joining us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Koel Banerjee, and it gives me immense pleasure to extend a warm welcome to you all. We are thrilled to begin the fourth public lecture of 2025, focusing on the compelling topic, the other side of reality, examining speculative fiction, presented by the esteemed speaker, Dr. Indrani Dashgupta. Before we delve into the fascinating subject, allow me to briefly introduce our organization, CSRF. The CSRF, a student-led non-profit organization started in 2022, is founded on the belief in the transformation power of knowledge. We organize free public lectures, discussion, and covering a diverse spectrum of cultural topics ranging from literature, art, to music and food. Our aim is to empower students by exposing them to novel ideas. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Indrani Das Gupta, who currently serves as an assistant professor in the Department of English at Maharaja Agrawal College, University of Delhi. Dr. Dashgupta completed her doctoral research in the area of Indian science fiction at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Her research interest encompasses popular culture, sports studies, cultural studies, and film studies. Her articles and chapters have been published by renowned publishers such as Routledge, Bloomsbury, and Macmillan. Recent publications include a co-edited book on Gandhi and chapters exploring Bollywood dance, Rudyard Kipling, and science fiction. Notably, she has also served as the fiction editor of Mithila Review, an international journal of science fiction and fantasy. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Indrani Dasgupta for this CSRF talk. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Koel. Thank you so much for this warm welcome, and thank you to Valat, Education. I think you're doing a fabulous job in extending all these free lectures. We do need these free lectures. When I was a student, we really didn't have much of these resources, 5 to 7 years back. We none of have this. But now that you're all doing things, I think so you're doing a fabulous job in that. And thank you so much. Thank you so much also for, giving me this opportunity to share these ideas which I have been exploring, through my, research, PhD research, and of course, otherwise as well. So thank you as well, Koel, for, being, the facilitator for this talk and so on. So with your permission, can I share my PPT?
Ma'am, there is no need to, take my permission. Okay, you can. Yeah, it's
Okay.
all yours. Yeah.
Okay, just give me a second and okay, so just give me a second. Yeah.
Yes, it is visible, ma'am.
It's visible, right?
Yes.
Okay. So my talk is titled today, The Other Side of Reality, Examining Speculative Fiction. While I'm going to, engage with the idea of what speculative fiction is and, a little bit of the history of speculative fiction, my focus would be, how, Indian science fiction is both a challenge to this idea of speculative fiction and also a continuation to that. So I will be moving on from speculative fiction The first part of my, talk would be on speculative fiction, and moving on from that, I will move on to, what do I understand and what do I mean by Indian science fiction and how it extends the possibilities that engenders in the idea of speculative fiction. So let me just continue with that. What do we mean by speculative fiction? When we talk about speculative fiction, the lexical and the etymological meaning of speculative fiction depends on three things particularly. I will start with the third one, wherein, speculative is borrowed from the Latin word, two Latin words, speculare, which means to observe, and specicere, which means to look at or view. Now, both of these, taken together actually means intelligent contemplation. Now, this is very important. What are we, contemplating, and where do we use our intellect here? In what manner do we use our intellect here? Which brings us to the first point here, the fact principle. Most of our literature, when we talk about literature, usually the idea of a literature and all our universities, the syllabi and everything, revolves around the idea of realism, something that follows the principles of verisimilitude, like it is grounded in facts. This can happen. Just give me a second. I need to open the door because my maid is here. Just give me a second. Just 1 second.
Sure, ma'am. Guys, please keep waiting within
So
within
sorry.
few
So sorry.
seconds. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
So basically, when you're
No, ma'am,
talking
it's okay.
about the fact principle here, it's speculative fiction is one which is believed to be not grounded in facts. Unlike the realist texts of, let's say, you must have read it in your Victorian classes and so on, dealing with Charles Dickens or, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And most of the texts that you have read over the years, even texts such as, let's say a Chetan Bhagat, they deal with the idea of realism. That's something that exists in the world of the text. It's something that you can find it in the world outside as well. It mirrors society. Now, when you talk about speculative fiction, this is taken to task. The idea that, what you find it in the world of the text, in the world of the novel, the short story, and so on, you might not find it in the world outside. So the question of facts, the intelligent contemplation of facts is questioned. It's doubted. It's brought, or rather, it's problematized. The second question is the question of opinion formation. The word speculation, if you look into, OUP dictionary, you will find, it is dealing with, forming of opinions, wherein speculation is more a doubt rather than a certainty. Something that you cannot claim it with full conviction that this is what has happened or will happen, and so on. Now, which brings us to, if we bring all of these three facts together, what do we come to the conclusion? What is speculative fiction? Speculative fiction is something that allows us to think, to reflect, but without drawing any final conclusion. It allows us to, inhabit the position or the state of liminality, where we are unsure of what is going to happen or what has happened and will happen in the near future. And the fact that it allows the formation of opinion is that it allows the readers, that is, all of us who are reading these texts, not to be passive readers. We become, the dynamic producers of meaning, and which makes speculative fiction as something that is, you would find it's involved with possibilities and probabilities. It deals with a lot of possibilities. You can do with it a lot of things. It's not about what is already out there, as Aristotle would have said it, when he talked about it in his Poetics, that history is things that has already happened and literature is things that might happen. Now, speculative takes Aristotle's views in his Poetics to his, complete paradigm, to its T, and says that, okay, we will try to give you a world, shape a world, construct a world which depends on our opinions. These opinions might be or might not be real. Yet at the same time, it will allow us to observe, to look at and view our world, our human civilization, our technologies, the world we inhabit in a closer and a more nuanced, comprehensive manner. Taking this further, so what does speculative means? So defining, speculative fiction, this is the definition which was provided by the International Speculative Fiction Organization. And the author of this, as I have written it here, is Marek Osiewicz. So Marek Osiewicz said that it's a subgenre of science fiction. So speculative fiction is a part of science fiction that deals with human. Now, this is a very important point, that deals with human rather than technological problems. A genre distinct from and opposite to science fiction in an exclusive focus on possible futures, and a super category for all genres that deliberately depart from imitating consensus reality of everyday experience, which is what I was talking about. Speculative fiction does not deal with the world outside as we all know it, as we are all familiar with. It deals with a reality which few of us might share, might, be a part of in our, understanding, but few of us might not understand it. So it does not deal with consensus reality. So it is also super category form. What do I mean by super category form? That speculative fiction, even though it borrows a lot of elements from science fiction, it is not primarily science fiction. It does not simply deal with technologies. Rather than it includes fantasy, science fiction, horror, and, lots of hybrids and, cognate genres like gothic, dystopia, weird fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction, ghost stories, superhero tales, fairy tales, slipstream, magic realism, all kinds of steampunk and so on. All of these are part and parcel of speculative fiction. Now, the question is, now this is where it becomes highly interesting, and which is what I want you to all think about. Why do we need a super category form? Why do we need the super category, definition out here when we did have science fiction? When we, even though you're saying that it borrows heavily from science fiction, you are also saying it is more like fantasy, it is gothic, it is romance, it is adventure story, it is also magic realism. So is it because we wanted to include several genres, which is why we wanted another term for such kinds of literature? Or was it more than that? And the answer is, it was more than that. What is it? So we come to what is science fiction? First, let us try to understand what is science fiction before we move on to the history of speculative fiction. In his book of Metamorphosis of Science Fiction, Darko Suvin is the founder of Science Fiction Studies Journal. And it is this book, particularly Metamorphosis of Science Fiction, which was published in 1979, that inaugurated the discourse of science fiction studies in the Western world. And of course, it was borrowed by the other parts of the world as well. So he defined, it is his definition, which has become the science fiction definition. So we start reading his definition. What did he say? He said that science fiction is a literary genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition. Now, this is where I want you all to focus in. The word estrangement is borrowed from Bertolt Brecht's theory of Wolfram-Jung's effect. So if you are, familiar with Bertolt Brecht's epic theater in Mother Courage, or, the other books that he wrote, can't remember right now, but Mother Courage is one of his most famous one. The tales of, the Szechuan, all of those stories that he wrote about, he said that, our world, if you want to, try to bring about a change, if you want to bring about a change, you should be, allowing the readers to be, put up, positioned in a world which is differentiated, from the world that they are familiar with. They should be estranged from their familiar world, from their realistic world. That's the first thing that Bertolt Brecht said in his epic theater, and which Suvin borrowed in his definition of science fiction. So, science fiction is something that estranges us, that separates us, that alienates us from our present everyday world of reality. That's the first thing that he said. The second thing that he said was the presence and interaction of cognition. Now, what do we mean by cognition? Cognition is something that is, let's say, when you talk about cognition, cognition is intellect, the use of intellect, reason, rational ability. And it depends on the idea that, this intellectual ability depends and is grounded on factual knowledge, and knowledge that can be verified. So if you have a hypothesis, you need to verify it according to certain, experiments and so on, which is what he means here, the use of reason. It's not emotion. He's not saying psychology. He's not saying feelings. He's using the word cognition, primarily paying emphasis to the idea of science as something that is revolving around the paradigms of reason here. So estrangement plus cognition and their presence and interaction, which makes it into a literary genre, is what was defined by Suvin as science fiction. Now, cognition, when you think about cognition, Suvin's understanding of cognition was, I would say, highly parochial, very narrow. He explained cognition in terms of how the Western world defined science itself, the discourse of science. So science is, as we will all, agree with it at one level, because we have also been taught according to the same paradigms, that science is, based on facts. Science is based on objective, something which is based on objective knowledge. You will not use your reason here, your emotions and feelings here. Instead, whatever you claim, you will have to prove it. You will have to validate your claims by using certain scientific methodologies and so on. So cognition, by cognition, science, Suvin explained it very clearly. It is differentiated from fairy tales and a fantasy. Now, this is quite interesting, because when you read the word speculative, you also read it. Speculative is a super category, kind of a word, which includes fantasy, which includes horror, which includes mystery. It might include a fairy tale. It might include, magical elements. It might include ghost stories and so on. So how then this came to be? From science fiction, which was completely a compartmentalized, kind of a study of literature, where science fiction was completely based on rational knowledge. Even though it was literature, it was based and grounded on facts, something that could be verifiable. How did it become something that was more expanded into the wider category of fantasy and magic? And why? Why did we need to expand the idea of fantasy? And which is where we come to this gentleman here, and which is this film, Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein was a science fiction critic, author, and also a journalist. He was a journalist. He used to write specifically, he was part of the Liverpool University and he used to write for them. And this is his most famous essay on the writing of speculative fiction, which was published in 1947. It was also revised in 1948. In this, he said that what we mean by science fiction depends on the qualities of speculation. And he explained what he meant by speculation. And furthermore, he used another word, extrapolation. He said that any story that you claim to be science fiction needs to be differentiated into science fiction and speculation. Science fiction is based on hard facts. By hard facts, he means that, if you have a story, let's say about robots, you describe what a robot does, what he, goes on to do, and blah, blah. Dealing with all about technology, dealing with all about technological elements. It could have an educative value. It could have a little bit of, other kind of fictional value. It could entertain us. But by and large, the story would be based on what, the present knowledge of all the technologies constitutes and says about, let's say, robots. Robert Heinlein, on the other hand, explained it very clearly. The speculative fiction or speculative science fiction, this is the word he used. Speculative science fiction we use a technology, a present day technology, let's say on robots again, or AI in today's world, and we take it from the present, reality and place it in some other reality. That's the first thing. We extrapolate it. We take it out from a familiar reality, from a familiar understanding. We place it elsewhere, whether in the past or whether in the future, does not matter. It could be any. But instead of dealing with the technology per se, which you would find it in science fiction, we now deal with human action. We deal with how the technology has refashioned human societies. How human, navigate these technological ecosystems. How the human beings cope with these new situations brought forward by technological marvels. And he makes it very clear what he meant by speculative fiction is not about the new situation. It is about coping with problems arising out of the new situation. So it's about how human beings deal with technologies. It's how about, human stories evolve over a period of time because of certain technologies that were invented and instituted by, let's say, by governments and so on. So by and large, it's not about facts. Robert Heinlein makes it clear that it's about, human stories, about human dealings, about human relationships. It could be, something to deal with human and economy, how the economy changes and how it impacts, let's say a family. Or it could be, simply how it impacts, a couple, their romance. Does it change? So basically, he's not dealing with technology. The technology could be anything. He's dealing with the human actors out here. This, Robert Heinlein's, essay was a huge, movement, I would say. It took us from Darko Sewin's 1979 understanding of science fiction, of cognition and estrangement. It took us on the path of actually, representing science fiction or science fiction speculative stories as basically not dealing with the abstract world of science and technologies. It is not dealing with scientific epistemologies, but it's dealing with the world of humans and how the human actors deal with these knowledges. And this was taken on further. If we go on further here, there were other, players, who, took on further on this road of speculative fiction. So by the 1960s and 70s, after Robert Heinlein and Darko Sewin, we came for, many writers and critics and scholars came forward and they inaugurated the new wave of science fiction writing. These included writers like Philip K. Dick. I'm sure many of you have heard these names out here. Philip K. Dick, Damon Knight, Ursula K. Le Guin. Ursula K. Le Guin is one of the greatest writers of science fiction. Joanna Russ, Octavia Butler, Brian Attebery, and so on. And then there were few, journalists, come writers, come critics, like Judith Merrill, John Moorcock. They all, focused on the human drama rather than on the technologies per se. Now, these all are very important because it takes us from the narrow parochial understanding of science and technology as defined by Darko Sewin to the world which was more expansive. to the world of human drama, to the world of human societies with all its cognates of politics, economics, culture, rituals, religion, you name it. You can include a lot of things, all of that which were, reshaped and refashioned by technologies. Interesting, right? But there are other facets to it. Let's come to this other facet. The question is, from science fiction to speculative fiction, what exactly happened? What made this happen? What, forced these writers like, Robert Heinlein, Judith Merril, John Moorcock, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler to rename their stories, their, work as not simply science fiction, but as speculative fiction. And we come to this crisis of legitimation. I'm sure many of you will agree with me here. You're all studying. So you would be knowing that in our universities, we really do not have a science fiction paper out there. And even if it is now introduced in the last 2 years, at least in Delhi universities, it has been introduced. Please note that these, kind of literature, it's a very new phenomenon. And even though it's a, let's say, an optional paper, it's not the core paper. The students can choose. Science fiction was by and large taken to be a vulgar kind of literature. It was a literature not to be read by the intellectual classes. It was a literature that was meant to be read and studied, and if at all examined, only by the lower classes, the lower section of the population. So, which is why these writers like a Robert Heinlein and a John Moorcock or a Judith Merril, they tried to deal with this crisis of legitimation. That, they wanted to make their field of study legitimate. They wanted, science fiction to come from the margins, to become a part of the mainstream culture. That's the first thing. Second thing, which is related to the first one itself, is this critiquing of the idea of the popular. I'm sure, when you talk about the word popular literature, just go and study, OUP. We start off with OUP dictionaries, and you will find that popular is something that is read by the masses. Read by the masses, immediately you come across, the Frankfurt School of, philosophy, wherein masses usually mean people who have, no choice. They're forced to study this because they have no other option. They are part of a consumerist society, and their, choices, their agency has been denied. So popular again becomes a very disparaging term where you have lost your choice, your own, voice out here. So this is also being reworked here. It has been critiqued and dismantled by moving on from the title science fiction to the word speculative fiction. Speculative, you will all say that in literature, we do speculate. We do look, we do observe. We, intelligently contemplate. And we, rethink. We refashion. We do all of that. We are always reading and intelligently reading. So popular becomes something that is being critiqued and dismantled by its movement from science fiction to speculative fiction. Right? The second one is, the third one, sorry, is the 1960s cultural turn. I'm sure that, you are aware of that the 1960s was the heyday of all kinds of theories. From the first wave of feminism, we moved on to the second wave, where it was not simply of trying to, afford women a little bit of more professional choices, a little bit of more educational opportunities. In the second wave of feminism, we started asserting our rights in multifarious ways. As women, we started asserting our rights. 1960s was also the time of the Vietnam War. I hope you're all aware of the history of the American and the Vietnam War and how the Vietnamese, tried to, challenge the system out there. Those, subaltern, the dispossessed, the poor people out there, how they challenged the mighty Americans out there. The 1960s was also the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King. And of course, it was also the Woodstock phenomena. You have, the Beatles, all of these, the working class generation. And then, of course, there was the whole theory of a Derrida, of a Roland Barthes, the deconstructionist movement that became hugely popular. All of them had a huge impact, on how science fiction slowly and slowly expanded its terminology and became speculative fiction. It was not that science fiction was not being used. Please keep this in your mind. It was still being used. But whenever you refer to science fiction at this point in time, you refer to something that a story which dealt primarily with only technologies, and the human actors and the human emotions and feelings was only playing a secondary part. So when you talk about speculative, you're dealing primarily with the human stories who probably might have been placed in future possible scenarios or in a dystopian world of technologies and so on and so forth. And you're trying to deal with how they deal, how these, voices now speak for themselves. So the 1960s cultural turn had a huge impact of this whole channelization of science fiction to speculative fiction. It was a time when the subalterns, the dispossessed, started making their presence felt. The margins were being dismantled and critiqued. It was being problematized. Last but not the least, the question of the genre. Seuvin's understanding of science fiction was based on a very formalized notion of science. Science is something that is verifiable. Science is something that is objective. Science is a neutral kind of an, disimpassioned kind of a field of study and discipline. Science is something that ought to be verified. It is grounded in facts. These were all very formalized generalization, a generalization that will remain. Even when histories and politics and societies change, it will still remain the same. Something that is universal knowledge. Now, this was also questioned, the idea of the genre as a formula. And instead, genre became something that became identifiable with the notion of dynamic, something that was in flux, always in shifting configurations. So instead of, basically saying this is what science fiction is all about, you allowed now the readers to intervene, bring in their own cultural understanding of the word. What do they understand by science? How they have understood it. And this allowed a societal regime of reading to come and invest on this whole problematics of genre. So genre was something that was not out there. You put it, there's a bottle out there and you just put in your elements and it becomes science fiction. Instead, this bottle could, take on any shape. If at all, it remains a bottle. It could be a square, it could be a rectangle, it could be a bottle, it could be anything. It could keep on changing, depending on where we come from. There could be certain resemblances with other, previous generation of science fiction, or it could be something altogether new. So the dilemma of this genre, the boundaries, the rigid boundaries between science and, let's say, emotion, feelings, that started to crumble. That started to, fall apart. So genre, instead of genre, speculative fiction questioned these boundaries between, let's say, fantasy and science and magic, science and realism, science and ghost stories, science and romance. They started questioning these rigid boundaries, this fixed categorization. And knowledge became all pervasive in one sense, and also knowledge became porous. It became porous. You could move from one, kind of a boundary, earlier boundaries, you could move on to other boundaries. So far, so good. I hope you're all with me on this. And this brings us to what is speculative fiction, a conundrum. It's a catch-all moniker, so that means it is science fiction, it is fantasy, it is ghost stories, it's romance, it's a weird fiction, it's Hope Punk, it's a cyberpunk, and XYZ. It's a catch-all moniker, right? Reality principle, even though we might be dealing with, lots of other things, the ghosts and the, whatever, it's the, let's say, the world of the aliens and so on, we are still concerned with the idea of reality principle at one level. Why? Because if you write anything that comes to your mind, nobody will participate in it. So somewhere or the other, it needs to be grounded somewhere in your own understanding of reality, which ought to be shared by at least one or two other people. So the reality principle is still there. We cannot avoid it. It's still part of it. Yet at the same time, what you've done with speculative fiction, you have expanded the value and significance of scientific rationality. Science is not simply objective knowledge. Science could also be fantasy, right? And at the same time, you enroll the fantasy in Marxist literary science fiction criticism. Marxist literary science fiction criticism, which is the cognitive estrangement of Darko Seuven. He was a Marxist critic, by the way. So what the Bertolt Brecht and Darko Seuven explained, that science fiction is all about the presence and the interaction of cognition and estrangement. You include even fantasy, myth, rituals, religion, or opinion as part of that. And last but not the least, you include the idea of the genre. Genre is ever shifting. Genre could be a family resemblance. Genre could be, informed by the positioning of the reader, what kind of reader is reading it, whether that reader, belongs to a specific society, and because of which the value of scientific rationality will change and the value of the fantastic will change. Now, this is where my intervention of Indian science fiction comes to be. Indian science fiction, and I am putting it here as an intervention. Intervention in the idea of, let's say, what do you mean by speculative fiction? For me, I am not, I do not agree with the idea of science fiction and speculative as being two different things. First and foremost, for me, Robert Heinlein's differentiation of the world of hard science fiction with the world of speculative science fiction, I would say is simply, he wants to have both the cake and the cream. He does not want to lose out on the Western understanding of science. At the same time, he wants to expand the Western epistemology of science. He wants to have both of the world. I would rather look at it, science fiction as something that is part of our popular imaginary. It is out there. Popular imaginary means each and every one of us throughout the generations. Let's say even during the ancient times and even till now, we have all our understandings. We have different understanding of the idea of science and the idea of fantasy. It has never remained the same. As much as it deals with the idea of, let's say, the Western science, because we have studied Western science, our NCERT books are all about Western science. So science, we do deal with, science, scientific imagination, technology, scientific ecosystem, all of that is there. But in Indian science fiction, and this is what my, PhD research was all about, I refuse to draw a boundary between science and fiction. You might say, ma'am, then this becomes speculative fiction. No, not necessarily. What I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to problematize the word or the epistemologies of science and the epistemology of fiction. Fiction is not all lies and science is not all truth. Science can also be exclusive. It can, exclude certain truths. It can marginalize certain truths. At the same time, fiction is not all lies. It can include certain truths out there. So the first thing that we do when we are reading Indian science fiction, and I will give you a few specific examples here, that when we, are, trying to read and examine Indian science fiction, we are trying to negate this idea of science fiction and speculative fiction as being two separate, kind of fiction. For me, Indian science fiction is an understanding of science that includes speculation, extrapolation as one of its elements. And it actually problematizes the whole discourse of science. What do we know about science? To put it, in, smaller, just a little bit of, I would say a kind of a understanding here. What do we know about science? Science, most of us, particularly, science was first as a subject introduced during the time of the British colonial administration. After Lord Macaulay's Minutes in 1835, science was first introduced in, universities like, the Hindu College, which later on became the Presidency College of, Kolkata. It was first introduced there. And of course, all of these, the science that was introduced there was hard facts. You take up one hypothesis, you prove it if it can be proven by, whatever, technologies and tools and paradigms that you have, then it's a fact. Then it's truth. Then it's the reality. This was what it was taught. Now, please remember when Lord Macaulay introduced science as one of the disciplines that was to be taught in Indian universities, he made it very apparent that science is something that is part of Western imagination. Indians, or let's say, the eastern part of the world, the Arabs and so on, even if they had science at one point in time, it was way back in the past. They have lost that knowledge so far. And you have that famous, line by Lord Macaulay, one single shelf of European library is, more than enough of the whole libraries and the world of civilization of Indian and the Arabs out there. And the reason why he said it was because of the usage of science. So science became a tool of colonial modernity. Science became a tool of colonial politics. Science became a tool of power. Science became a tool wherein hierarchies were drawn between the Western white man and the Indians, brown people out here. Science became, the idea of science that was proliferated and promulgated by Lord Macaulay's Minutes made it very clear that science was part of the world of binaries and polarities. It was couched in those terms. So when Indian science fiction initially, it went through a lot of layers. There were a lot of layers, lot of, different stages of science fiction you will come to an understanding. They tried to question this idea of science. They tried to bring in their own intervention. They tried to problematize. And without using the term science or speculative or otherwise, the kind of literature that was spawned from the 1880s onwards was one in which you started questioning the boundaries, the rigid boundaries that existed between genres. So the Indian science fiction, which I am describing, is Indian science fiction became a mode of discussion in which the readers were positioned to intervene, to critique, to dismantle, to challenge, to problematize colonial forms of knowledge. That was how it came to be. The moment of inception of Indian science fiction, if you have to understand, it needs to be understood in terms of its point of protest. It was a literature of protest. It was a literature that challenged hegemonic discourses of the day. And the primary, hegemonism, that came to be, it tried to bring about an understanding that science was not all what the Western world described. There was more to science, and they brought in our own understanding of science here. Science was not simply facts. as George Basala explained it in his, article. He'd said, the Indians were simply, or rather the Indian civilization was a tabula rasa, blank slate. They knew nothing about science. They had no knowledge about scientific, knowledge or technology and so on. They were all dumb fools. So when the Indians started reading science in their universities and started writing them, their understanding of science went through a lot of, permutations and combinations. Science was hard facts, could be. They're not saying no, but science could also be, let's say Thakumarjuli, grandmother's tales. Science could also be tall tale, like Sukumar, Ray wrote it in his very, very famous short story, Keshuram Hushiare Diary in 1922. Science was also in which, Indian, consumerism came to the forefront, like you have it in Jagdish Chandra Bose's Niruddeshev Kahani, which was republished again in 1921 as Palatak Tufan. In all of these different ways, they started questioning the idea of science itself and the idea of fiction as well. Fiction is not simply a kahani. It's not simply a lie, a fabrication. It is not a misjudgment. Fiction became an intervention to reread science, to, deal with science in a different way. So what I mean by Indian science fiction here is an Indian science fiction deals with the science fiction or speculative. You can name it speculative. I'm not naming it speculative. For me, Indian science fiction deals with speculation. It deals with thinking. You first think what is happening in and around you. You reflect on it. You keep on, ruminating upon it. You meditate on your present reality. And you try to present an alternate version of the reality. Either it could be through the medium of any kind of technology that you're aware of, or any other kind of technology that, might not be there in your own world. It might be anywhere else in the world, or you've just simply made it up. Or it could be a mixture of, let's say, the mythical and the ritualistic elements of our Indian sensibility. So the Indian science fiction, please, if you want to understand it, Indian science fiction, for me at least, it is an extension of the debate between Darko Sewin and Robert Heinlein's science fiction versus speculation. It's an extension. It takes us beyond that paradigm of that debate. It is no longer narrow, like Darko Sewin's understanding of science fiction. It is not simply about cognition, and neither it is simply a catch-all moniker. It is just beyond that. It takes apart this idea of speculative fiction. Robert Heinlein said there could be two kinds of fiction, hard science fiction, and there could be speculative fiction, which deals with human drama. Indian science fiction brings it, says that science fiction, when you talk about science fiction, it is both technology, it is both human drama, it is also fantasy, it's also music, but it's primarily about doing, reading, understanding, comprehending science and how we know it. It's a world of opinion formation. It's the world of intelligent contemplation. So Indian science fiction primarily became a term, which I will now use another word, worldling. It's a world where you are doing, making, remaking, reshaping the world anew. The world of science, the world of technology, the world of fantasy. Having gone on further before, just to give you an idea, what do I mean by Indian science fiction? Indian science fiction can be primarily divided into three phases. Of course, there will be further sub-phases to it, but these are the three main phases. The first phase begins from 1835 till 1947, and one in which you are primarily dealing with the colonial or the Western forms of understanding of science, and you're actually trying to bring about a new kind of literature, So the few examples that I gave you, of course, was Hishuram Hishyare Diary, then Nirudeshar Kahani. Then, of course, the first, science fiction story ever to have been written in India was in Bengali, and it was written by Hemlal Dotto in 1880, and the story was titled Rahasya. The second one, which was published, was in 1892, and this was Shukra Brahman by Jagadanandan Ray. Then there were few which was written in Hindi. Then Ashcharya Janak by Pandit Ramaprasad. And there were few Keshav Chandra Dutt, and they all wrote it. So colonial modernity, what do we understand by the phase here? Basically, in this, phase, Indians are primarily, dealing, overtly, I would say, overtly and in a very covert fashion, they are trying to bring in an Indian sensibility of understanding and doing science. So in Hishuram Hushyare Diary, just to give you one example, there is this explorer, a scientific explorer, and he is Professor Hishuram Hushyare. And this fellow has gone on an expedition with, fellow, travelers and so on, where he encounters few, strange animals, and he gives these animals certain names like Gomratherium, Hanglatherium, and so on. Now, these names, if you notice the names here, Gomra is a Bengali word, which means, having sporting or sullen expression. Therium is a word which is borrowed from the Latin suffixes. Hangla is somebody who is always hungry, a gluttonous kind of a creature. So, Hangla Therium. Now, this mixture of the Bengali plus the Latinate words substitutes the power and the hierarchization of English culture and the English culture of doing science. Science is, as Hishuram Hushyare would describe it, is like a tall tale. It's like telling a fantasy story. It could be real, it could be not real, but it also is one where you question the power, the hierarchies that exist in our society. Jagdish Chandra Ray's, Nirudeshar Kahani is one in which a father is traveling on a ship, and all of a sudden a storm, he encounters a storm, and many people, they trying to somehow, maneuver the ship out of the storm, but they were failing. And when he remembers that he has an Indian oil, in his suitcase, he brings that oil and he throws the contents of the oil into the sea. And the storm immediately is, blown apart. And he's saved. Of course, this story was written as an advertisement for an Indian hair oil, by the way, hair oil. But basically what it does, it challenges the supremacy of Western scientific knowledge. Something that is as ordinary and as mundane as a hair oil, Indian hair oil, is the one which, manages to, literally blow apart this storm in which, even the Western philosophers and the scientists have failed to do so. So colonial modernity primarily deals with the idea of science as a form where you can intervene and bring in a voice of the subaltern. When we come to the second phase, which is post-colonial modernity and Indian science fiction, this is from 1947 to 1980. Basically, we are dealing with the idea of the state here. How does science becomes one of the most institutional tools of state machinery? Even now, I'm sure many of you are aware of the NEP and so on, and its importance that is, paid to AI and other kinds of scientific paradigms. So on, it was during that time of the independence as well, during the time of 1947. Science was, thought to be one of the ways which could, I would say, revive our Indian civilization. So Nehru's whole, 5-year planning and, all those, the steel industries that he brought about, they were all part of that whole scientific epistemologies, which he believed that will usher us into modern civilization. Now, the problem with this post-colonial modernity is these, scientific paradigms became part and parcel of a state bureaucratic machinery. So science became also part of a certain corrupt regime. So here, if you notice in post-colonial modernity and Indian science fiction, wherein you will find, Satyajit Ray's, stories, then you have, Premanando Mitro's stories. All of those stories deal with the idea of science as, basically going beyond the nationalist paradigms, going beyond a certain territorial sovereignty to bring about a global conglomerate of understanding of science. So Satyajit Ray's story where he's dealing, the story of the diary of the space traveler, he is actually dealing with the idea that science is something that is, enables us to forge international brotherhood. And this brotherhood, which was aligned with his non-aligned, policies, was something that could, literally bring to the fore the third world countries, bring a new kind of a power block, one that could challenge, could, reshape the whole, these third world countries who had all long suffered in the hands of the imperialist regimes. So post-colonial modernity, there were a variety of themes here. Variety, from state to family, to marriage, to institute schools. Lots of stories you could find. So you have Leela Majumdar's stories. She was a niece of, Satyajit Ray. She wrote a lot of stories on caste politics and science. Most of them were Bengali. And, you have few other stories that dealt with, science in terms of saving the whole world, where the Indian scientists, they come forward, they save the whole world. Basically, it's like, we were now taking the center stage. And lastly, we come on from the 1980s till the present day, it's still continuing global modernity. Now, this is the phase I want you to, pay a little bit more attention to, because in this particular phase, you're dealing with the idea of science, something that is global. That means multiple forms of scientific communication, scientific configuration, and science fiction conglomerates have now been formed. So you have no longer you're dealing with only American science fiction. You're no longer dealing with British science fiction. You're also dealing with Argentinian science fiction. You're dealing with the whole Latin American world of science fiction. You're dealing with Russian science fiction. You're dealing with Australian science fiction. Many nationalities have come to the fore, and all of them are reshaping this global world. At the same time, you're dealing hugely with neo-capitalism, and which is where you started rethinking about the value of humanity itself. When the AIs turn up, the cyber world, that we live in and inhabit, the world of the matrices and the Blade Runners, it forces us to question, what do we mean by humanity? What is human after all? So the post-humanist world also now comes to the fore. So basically nowadays, the story which was inaugurated from 1980s onwards by Salman Rushdie's Grimace, it moved on to, Amitav Ghosh's The Calcutta Chromosome. Finally, it moved on to Manjula Padmanabhan's Escape, An Island of Girls, sorry. And then we move on to Vandana Singh. We have, Samit Basu. We have Indrapramit Das. We have a lot of other writers who are now coming up, who are writing in several genres, who are writing, whether in drama, in romance and everything. At the same time, all of them are questioning the idea of scientific world. They're questioning the idea of power machinery that exists in our world. They're questioning the whole idea of, the possibilities that exist for us as a nation, as a state, and as part of a global community. Taking on further here, conundrum of Indian science fiction. Despite the fact that science fiction, Indian science fiction, extends this idea of kalpo-vigyan. It is both kalpo means something that is fantastic, and Vigyan, which is scientific knowledge. Vigyan could also mean something that is knowledge, comprehensive knowledge as well. So it takes us forward on this Kalpo Vigyan. But how do we read? Do we read it as one which is coming after the Western science fiction? As something that is a pale derivative and imitation of the Western science fiction? Or ones where the words fail to describe the nature of Indian science fiction? I would rather go for the word, the words fail. Indian science fiction is still an evolving field. It's a mode of discussion. It's a mode of deliberation where we think about our real world using different modes and machineries at our disposal. We use science, but that does not mean science has to be grounded in facts. This science could be revitalized using lots of other, what you call paradigms out there, from a ghost story, from a romance to everything out there. How to read this science fiction, Indian science fiction? I would say instead of using the word speculative, instead of using the word extrapolation, we rather use the word world link. It's a world, it's a new world, but it's also worlding. ING is used here. That means it's a world that is still being shaped. It is still dynamic, it's still continuing. And it will continue to evolve as many readers, as different generations come to be. So Indian science fiction remains a dynamic terrain. It is ever changing. How do we read it? Whether it's science or speculation or both or neither. It's both. It's more than that as well. There's more to science. It's not simply objective form of knowledge that can be verified. It's not simply speculation that simply contemplates intelligent contemplation. It is not simply a catch-all moniker. It rather makes us think and pause, take a pause and try to think about the whole discourse of science that has evolved from the Western world and that has been disseminated through imperialism across different parts of the world. It makes us question these, different paradigms, the social paradigms that have so far shaped our world, from capitalism, industrialization to imperialism. It makes us question all of that. So at one level, what is Indian science fiction? I would say it's a world of ideas that makes us pause and think and reflect. It is both an extrapolation. It takes us from our ordinary, familiar world into a different, alternate world of possibilities. It's a world where reality and magic both coexist. In fact, both the world coalesce. You cannot draw boundaries at all. It's speculation. We think, but we are also questioning the idea that facts and fabrications are not separate entities. They might be one and the same thing, only that, we are giving it a different name. The next point is, what is Indian about Indian science fiction? Now, of course, the word, when we talk about Indian, we come to that whole debate between, Azaz Ahmad and, Frederick Jameson, where Jameson, literally, put us all into the world of, national allegories. All Indian science fiction are national allegories. I'm not doing that. What I mean by Indian is specifically something which is very literal, written by Indian writers, one. Secondly, it uses Indian sensibilities, from Indian folklores to Indian myths, to Indian certain traditions and rituals from different parts of our, regions of our, the Indian subcontinent and so on. It draws upon the Indian way of, politics or doing science. And this is, of course, as the word Indian says, it is also ever evolving. Because of globalization, the very idea of India has also, evolved. Like, in DDLJ, the famous movie of Shah Rukh Khan, when he's speaking to one other character, played by Amrish Puri, he said that, these pigeons comes from the same place as India. They might be in London at the present time, but, they might be in India, but probably they've come from London. So India is also part of the global world as much as global is part of the Indian world. So Indian becomes something like which is local. It's both global and it's local. And lastly, where is the Indian science fiction moving forward? It's moving forward. It's questioning a lot of generalizations that exist in our, way of reading speculative imaginaries, science fiction imaginaries, fictional imaginaries. It's trying to question the very idea of future. Future is it here in the now? A future is out there waiting to be unpacked. We will have to wait and see, but Indian science fiction definitely is very, very dynamic, vibrant. It has a cross-pollination of varying genres out there. And if you keep on reading the new genres, the new writers out there, like Arula Ratnakar, I would, if you are interested in Indian science fiction, I would request you all to go to Clark's World magazine and just type Arula Ratnakar and read her novellas. It's been published in Clark's World magazine. You can go on to read, Samit Basu, particularly his, stories of turbulence. That's pretty interesting. Then there is the game, the whole, what was that? Can't remember that name. Right now, there's some trilogy out there. And so you can read all of these and you will understand that science fiction as we know it is not simply about the British and out there, but it's also more than that. So I will leave you with that. And ma'am, the questions now, the
Yes,
discussions.
ma'am. Yes, of course. Really, ma'am, your expertise and passion for this speculative fiction were evident throughout your presentation. Thank you for guiding us through these things and offering a fresh perspective and encouraging us to consider the speculative fiction in another way. So now I would like to ask everyone if you have any query regarding today's talk to ma'am. You can just talk to ma'am. Otherwise, you can just use the chat box. And on YouTube, who are watching us, who are listening to us, they also can put their queries YouTube chat box. I will forward it to ma'am.
I would like those questions to come forward. Any doubts, anything that you want to discuss and share, anything that you've felt over the years. I'm sure many of you have read, have watched few science fiction, speculative imaginaries out there. Matrix and the Blade Runners and the Star Wars are of course very, very famous, but there have been few stories. If you are, watching on Netflix and Amazon Prime, continuously there are a lot of science fiction. So I'm sure you might have few questions. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you. No question? I
Ma'am,
guess.
I have one question.
Yeah, definitely, ma'am.
Yeah. How speculative fiction uses uh, futuristic settings to critique and reimagine existing social, political, and economic structure.
Hmm, 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 hmm. Well, one of the many things that when you talk about speculative is that it uses the mode of extrapolation, which you would also find it in Indian science fiction. To give you one example, I don't know how many of you have read Manjula Padmanabhan's Escape. Primarily in Escape, it's a novel, by the way. And in this novel, all the females, all female species have been exterminated, barring one. She was apparently saved by a family in which all the other females have already been killed by a technocratic, kind of a master. He's a sort of a clone. The clone is the master. And this female is there. She is living. She's in around 11 to 12 years old, around 12 to 13 years old girl. And apparently, her name is Meiji. And Meiji is the only single woman who is alive in this world of the AI generated clones. And these are her uncles are there who have apparently managed to save her. However, they realize they will not be able to save Meiji for so long. And which is when, they try to, take her to an island where only females exist and no males. So the whole story of escape is escaping from this, AI, clone generated general and so on, and taking her on this, arduous journey where, she can somehow be safe. However, while we are, undertaking this journey, we realize few things that even the uncles who managed to save this girl from death, from extermination, they are also as much involved in the killing of the other female species. And one of the uncles, whom we initially thought was her uncle, turned out to be her real father. So all of this, brings us to our present day world that we exist today in India. India has seen a lot of female infanticide. It actually borrows this element of the present day reality where females are still, regarded as a secondary citizen. And, either they are being killed or they're raped or the violence is, simply that is unthinkable. So this whole journey in which the whole landscape has become desolate, it's empty of any kind of fertility while, they go on this artist journey, a long journey, and many truths are unraveled. We realize this is the whole Indian reality, which has, panned out from our time, immemorial, and it's still continuing. So even though it's placed in a future, let's say 100 years from now, the story is, taking place in 100 years from now, the future world. But this futuristic world actually is extrapolated from a present day world where, women are negated, they are denied their voices and their agency. So escape is, where do we escape at all? When they land up in that island of, girls only, we realize that is as much violent world and abusive as the earlier world in which only males dominated. Here only the female voices. To a certain extent, what Manjula Padmanabhan is trying to do, she is questioning all these polarization, these binaries that exist in a world. If you have to create an equal society, you have to give space to all the genders, to all the sexes, to all the entities out there, not only to the human world, as we will see it in the Island of the Little Girls, which is the sequel to the story. You will realize that, the space should also be given to the animals, to the flora and the fauna. The nature is not simply a backdrop to human emotions. They are as much alive and vibrant, and which is where the post-humanist discourse comes into being, that man is not simply autonomous. It's not simply about, something, a different species that exists apart from the other flora and the fauna entirely. No, we are part and parcel of nature. And when we are part and parcel of nature, that means the whole discourse of man as an autonomous being, which started way back in 17th century in, the European world and was disseminated, outward to across different parts of the globe, that needs to be questioned and dismantled. So, yeah, I hope you answered your question, Quail.
Yes, yes, ma'am. So on this basis, can we tell this Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which was a Victorian novel, that is also comes into under the speculative fiction because that time we didn't have that term.
Yeah,
Only
we
science
didn't
fiction.
I agree with you. We
Yeah.
didn't have this term. The term, came into being, as I said, it became hugely popular. Even in 1948, 47, when Robert Heinlein came with that, essay, it was still not very popularized. By the 1960s, because of different cultural revolution, the countercultural movement of the 1960s, it became hugely popular. However, I would like you all to think, particularly the students here, that please do not put, all these monikers before you start reading any literature. You cannot simply say this is science fiction, this is fantasy, this is romance, and this is speculative. No. Move beyond these monikers, move beyond these generalizations and categorization, and start reading them as simply literature which takes us beyond ourselves, beyond the present day world, beyond where we can question and ruminate and think for ourselves and trying to create a world anew. That's what I want to say. You're absolutely right about the Victorian world, yes. Even those Victorian novels like H.G. Wells' Time Machine and so on, all of them were termed as social science fiction because they were dealing with something that is society, but they were science fiction. You
Right.
have Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they were all science fiction. But when it comes to, and even, we call Frankenstein by Mary Shelley as one of the first science fiction novel in the world. Though, of course, I'm not very sure Mary Shelley would like this terminology attached to her novel. But by and large, even Gulliver's Travels has been termed as an anti-science fiction novel. But we did have many instances of science fiction novels and novellas. But when it comes to speculative fiction, this is a very modern world wherein you are trying to extend the parameters of the world of science. However, what you try to do, you create two different parameters. One is science, specifically hard science, dealing with facts, dealing with certain technologies, as Robert Heinlein said, and one is speculative, which deals with the human drama. When it comes to Indian science fiction, as per my understanding, it is basically where it questions both the idea of science and speculation and tries to forge in a new kind of interventionist discourse. That's it.
Right, ma'am. Actually, I was working on post-humanism theory. That's why I talk.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
So,
I
post, when we are talking about science fiction in the Indian terrain, we are basically dealing with, post-colonial science fiction because one, of course, not because it's coming after colonialism and so on, but because we are constantly dealing with the idea of new colonialism as well. And also we are dealing with the whole, hegemony of colonial practices that continues till this day. So decolonizing Indian science fiction could also be another way to look at it. What I called by worldling could be a world of decolonizing practices, where we're trying to dismantle the practices of colonial forms of knowledge, the capitalist forms of knowledge, and trying to bring forth a new kind of a voice where the subalterns and the marginals can have their own say. So if you are all interested, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but Netflix came up with a show called The Three Body Problem. Now, this was written by Chinese, writer, and I would request you all to go and watch it. It's very interesting, and you would get a new kind of an understanding as what is, understood by science and what is understood by fiction. And you can, of course, read Dune. Dune is a classic Western science fiction story. Dune is, I think, so still available on Netflix. You can watch that as well. So Dune deals with the idea of hard facts, hard science facts, as Robert Heinlein would have described it. Three body problem is what I was describing about Indian science fiction. It questions the idea of science, it questions the idea of speculation, it questions the idea of fantasy, romance, you name it, and they are questioning it, they are problematizing it. So dismantling of certain compartmentalization of forms of knowledge is what I would describe Indian science fiction as doing it. It is reality, but it is also the other side of reality as the topic, I, named it. So that is what it is.
yeah, that actually truly justifies the topic of today's. Thank
Yeah.
you, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Anyone else? Yeah, there is a question from Renita that
Okay.
good evening, ma'am. So there is a movie named Yashoda starring the popular South Indian, yeah, actress Samantha Ruth Prabhu. This movie is rumored to have its inspiration from Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest. My
Hmm.
question revolves around the whiteness imagination. When it comes to imagining, here casting white or the preference to uh, Caucasian features, yeah, in Indian technology discourses. Since Indian speculative fiction, okay, challenges the Western paradigm, does this preference of casting white actors subdue this idea?
I would, it's a very interesting question that you have put forward here. And to think about it, my question is why would they, actually allow a Caucasian actor to, be a part of this Indian discourse is beyond me. I'm sure, the Indians, particularly when you're borrowing from, Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest, which won the Onassis Award in drama, when you borrowed or rather you were inspired by that story, you would have to have, the foreign element out here. Though to give the director credit, there was a white character in that particular story. So maybe that is the reason. However, if that character is playing an Indian story out here, I would say it's just like, he or she wants to sell the story to the wider Western world, which is why this is happening. This is another way, this is a very interesting thing. And this brings me to the idea that science fiction, even when it's being written by Indian authors nowadays, the mostly you would see that, Indian science fiction, the booksellers and all, there's a whole row of science fiction. They will write it as science fiction. And most of us would not, usually we will not go and venture into the science fiction aisle of books. Any, bookshop, famous bookshop you go, the science fiction aisle is usually, hardly anyone, visits. And if they they do visit and read the books out there, they hardly ever buy. So one of the many reasons is that science fiction still do not have many takers within the Indian market. We are still catering to the Western world. So which is why even when you find, there are wonderful stories out there, but they are yet to be read, they are yet to be examined and discussed. And when it's being discussed and analyzed, please note that they will have certain elements which somehow aligns with the Western, knowledge, Western policies in the present day. And that's unfortunate, but that is what is happening. So as Damon Knight explained, science fiction is a market genre. You can't help it. You have to sell your books. And unfortunately, within the Indian market, the books are still not being sold, which is why, one of the many reasons I said, science became speculation. Even, in the Western world, they found it difficult to sell their books, difficult for their books to be read in a scholarly manner. So Ray Bradbury and all, they all came up with this idea of speculation. Speculation because literature is what? After all, we all speculate, we think, we observe, we contemplate. So they came up with this term. But at the end of it, when you think about it, you have to sell the book not only to a wider market, you have to also sell the vision that you wish to promote. So to a certain extent, I think so we need to go beyond this, market-oriented kind of a definition or a market-oriented, kind of a generic understanding and classification of science fiction and trying to sell the story for what it's worth and to repeat, human element, whether they are couched in a technological story, in a future-oriented story, in a dystopian world or an utopian world, they will sell if it is written well. So at the end of it, we do need to write well. And there are few writers who are writing well, and they are now being, appreciated across the world. So in case you're all interested in Indian science fiction, you can, go on to read. There are several writers out there. There is one very, very brilliant writer. I don't know how many of you have read it, Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan. Her story of analog virtual and other simulations. This is a must read story. The 10% Thief, it's a conglomeration of different stories. So the 10% Thief is the best. It has been, nominated for the Hugo Science Awards, which is the #1 award in the world of science fiction. There is, of course, Arulan Ratnakar, whom I named earlier. And please go to Clark's World Magazine's website page. You will find her novella out there. The story is Submergence. It's a must read. Must read if you want to understand how Indian science fiction is taking the world by storm. And there is, of course, Indra Pramit Das's, his story is Kalina. Kalina is one of the most brilliant stories that have come across in, the present day times. Manjula Padmanabhan has, of course, is very well known. And another very favorite author of mine is Vandana Singh. So if you do get the time, do read her short collection of stories, Ambiguity Machines and Other Stories. Do read it. And ma'am can even share my, phone number. If you want to connect with me, I will be willing to, discuss with you, about these stories. They're wonderful pieces of stories that ought to be read and discussed. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope, Renika, you got your answer. Ma'am, on YouTube, someone is asking that actually that person is about to doing PhD related to blue humanities and speculative fiction. So
Okay.
he is, or he or she, I don't know, but the her ask is how works of China Melville, yeah,
Huh.
China Melville or Frank Sketching,
Hmm.
I don't know the correct pronunciation of that word, may
Hmm.
affect our understanding of non-human interaction and ocean as a person. Yeah.
Could you just repeat the question? China Melville's, story?
And may affect our understanding of non-human interaction and ocean as a person.
Yeah. I one of my, articles will soon be published by Rutledge. So this is on, particularly, I'm not taken on China Melville, But yeah, China Melville's story is basically one which deals with the idea of the oceanic imagination from the world of not of the, weird fiction. He writes weird fiction. So I think so it was some station. I can't remember the name of that particular novel. So basically his stories, it takes us from the world of, let's say, the present day familiar world. It's a completely weird kind of a, strange world we enter into, but this strange world is hugely connected with the world of the ocean. Whenever we think about history, we think about history in terms of, through the notion of the terrestrial imagination. We think in terms of, territories divided, like, let's say India, Pakistan, and, America, and so on and so on. But when it comes to oceanic imagination, we try to relate to history, to reality, to truth. We relate in terms of oceans, how the worlds are connected by oceans. It's not separated, not distanced by ocean, but connected by ocean. And this brings a complete reorientation and a refashioning on how we read the idea of science itself. When you talk about science, science has often been termed about, as, understood as a exclusive entity, one which excludes us, excludes the people who do not know science, excludes, let's say, the female, because we hardly have any female scientists. And even if we do have, we try to marginalize their presence within the world of science. So science is basically a very gendered kind of a terrain. Then, of course, there is this whole world of the rich versus poor. It's a very classic kind of classicist kind of a terrain as well. Few, the lower section of the population will not find a presence in the world of science fiction. But when you include the idea of the oceanic imagination and, trying to connect all of these, boundaries, these rigid boundaries, these rigid classifications starts falling apart. And which is where you can bring in new voices, new presences. You can, bring about a cross-pollination of all those voices which had so far been submerged in the sands of time. Also, at the same time, your political orientation and your economic orientation will now be more, revolving around the idea of trade, trade, economy, and politics itself will, depend upon mobility, because, you're dealing with the oceanic imagination. So mobility, movement, flag, what you call shifting configurations, they all become part of our imaginary out here. And which makes science fiction, again, or speculative imagination, or, the world of the weird science fiction, you're trying to question all these boundaries that are out there. You try to make sense, how did they all come about? How did these, configurations come about? Can they be changed? And who brought them? Whom are we addressing it when we are talking about all these hierarchizations that exist in our world? So Gina Melville, I would say, is one of the, very interesting author of our present day world, who in using these stories of weird, strange kind of a novum, novum is something new technologies, a new idea. He actually forces us to go back into our past and try to, bring about the change from where it all began. So literally is making us question, look inwards before we can think about the outward changes that can begin. I think so. China Melville is a very interesting author. And in case you want to deal with this whole conundrum of science, speculative, imaginary, fantasy, you name it, and you will find it. Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I hope who asked it, they got their answers. And yeah, so ma'am, we have come to the, the time already over. So we need to get with this done. And now I like to give you a vote of thanks. Thank you so much that you present before us that kind of imagination, and I can see it, when you are presenting the thoughts of yours with your words. I can imagine it. So your expertise and passion for this subject really evident, and your ability to connect complex academic concept with such clarity and enthusiasm is truly speculative or commendable, we can say. We deeply appreciate you taking the time for your busy schedule from your busy schedule to share your knowledge with us. And your presence has enriched our understanding and sparkled further curiosity about the power and potential of speculative fiction. So, on behalf of CSRF and Bhalat Education, I extend our heartfelt thanks for your captivating lecture. We are truly honored to have had you with us today. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
And
Koil.
now I would like to thank yeah, and also I'd like to thank with all sincerity to Dr. Kalyani Bhalat and Anand Haridas sir for being truly supportive for all our ventures. And lastly, but not the least, uh, thanks to all the attendees who contributed to the success of this event. Until we meet again, continue to explore and learn with Bhalat. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you,
And one
organizers.
more thing, if you have any questions regarding today's talk, you can just put forward it to me. I will just
Yeah,
go
please,
to
please. I
ma'am.
would
Yeah,
love to hear your views. And thank you so much, Koel
of
ma'am,
course,
for
of
giving
course.
me this opportunity. Thank you to Vala,
No,
institutions.
ma'am.
Thank you so much. It's been,
It's
wonderful
our
to
pleasure.
share my view.
Ma'am, would you like to share your email ID because someone is asking on YouTube that how
Yeah,
may
yeah.
I
I will share
contact
it
you?
on your WhatsApp group. Will that do?
Yeah, you can share it with me. I will post it in our Telegram group. We have a Telegram group of Cultural Studies Research Forum.
Oh, great, great.
Yeah.
Wonderful,
Yeah. I will
wonderful.
share the link with you, of course.
Sure, ma'am, sure.
Yeah.
So in case anyone has any query and they want to get in touch with me, so please feel free to do so. I will share my, my email account with ma'am here. Thank you everyone for joining in, for taking our time, and thank you, Kovind ma'am, for being such a nice
Thank you,
host.
ma'am.
You were so
Thank
kind
you.
and patient with me. I was, you told me to, give me this
No,
date, and
ma'am.
somehow or the other, I was not able to, fix a time for this lecture, but thank you so much for patiently waiting for me. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank
Ma'am,
you.
you can just end the meeting for all because you can do it.
Okay, I can end the meeting.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for joining in. Take care and stay safe.